Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I can have your attention. We've made a small adjustment to the schedule in deference to the long day. Of course, we cut up the lunch by 30 minutes. Then we'll hear Misha, and I'll talk about that. Quick break. And then very interesting panel, as I mentioned, on the whole of government approach to illicit networks focusing around atomic energy, and that will be chaired by my colleague, Phil Lawler. Discussion groups will end about 6 p.m., 1800, and you're invited if you'd like to just have a drink afterwards. That'll be right out here. In Marshall Hall, just wander over there. And I'll talk a little later about tomorrow's schedule, but it's going to be very interesting, and we want to start relatively early. We know you all have other pressing engagements and you're busy people, so we would ask for just one more day of your time to continue these very interesting presentations. Tomorrow with Majid Nawaz, and you don't want to miss him, Vice Admiral Lefevre of the National Counterterrorism Center, Robert Mazur, who worked undercover for 5 years, influential in bringing down Pablo Escobar empire, and has written a really interesting book as well on his life undercover. And finally, relating to our discussions earlier today, the Northern Virginia Regional Gang Task Force, including 2 former gang members who will be with us just to talk a little bit about their experiences. And I know we've touched on the foreign fighters and the extremists and the motivation for young people to join these groups, and I think we'll find all that very interesting. So I am going to ask my colleague, Doug Farah, to introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you, Stan, and again, thanks for being here. When Stan was looking around for people who might really know how to talk about the convergence of different illicit networks and how that economy works and how it's grown and all, I immediately thought of Misha, partly because, as a lot of us, he's still in journalism. I left journalism about 10 years ago. But as the world was changing rapidly, there were a group of people on the ground at the time when newspapers could still afford foreign correspondents and let you sort of go off and roam around and find out interesting things that weren't pressingly urgent for today. I began finding all of these weird and anomalous situations in Africa initially and then in Latin America, thinking, what is going on? I was seeing Hezbollah diamond dealers dealing with Israeli diamond dealers in the DRC, and weapons shipments going from Guatemala to Liberia for Charles Taylor, and diplomatic passports floating around. And I felt pretty much at sea. I didn't know what I was seeing. I didn't know what framework to put it into. I was struggling to figure out what the contours of this new world map were. And fortunately, there were a lot of other people doing this. One of the best of them was Misha. I have to say, though, before I turn the stage over to him, I don't like him much, because I had written a book. I was casting around very much for a second book to write. I'd come up with this great concept, which is going to be sort of this global look at transnational organized crime. And I was talking to some folks about it, like this, oh, you mean like this book, McMafia? And not only was it the book I wanted to write, it had a much better name than any of my books have ever had. So I really don't like him much, but he really knows what he's talking about. I'm deeply jealous. But he really has, I think, been influential in shaping how a lot of us look at the world, understand the world as it's changed. One of the things I think that he brings to the understanding of it is what I think is lacking a lot today, and that's really deep field experience. I spend a lot of time on the ground. Misha spent probably more and more in different countries, and I think until you sort of see it, smell it, poke it, touch it, it's very hard to get your head around this. And when I was first describing what I was seeing when the CIA asked me to come in and talk with them about some stuff I had written, and they said, this can't be true, and I was like, but I saw it. I was there, so I'm pretty sure this is right. They're like, no, that couldn't be it. And I think one of the great advantages someone like Misha and other folks who spend time in the field is that you see it, and it takes some time, sometimes years, for the analytic community who's basing on other things other than experiential knowledge. It was easy to dismiss us. I'm sure Misha had this in the early days. That's anecdotal evidence. Oh, that's just anecdotes. Well, it was anecdotal evidence based on what you could see, feel, and touch, which to me constituted over time a body of evidence. I think the body of evidence that Misha has put together is incredibly important and really sort of been in the forefront, like I said, in helping a lot of us shape how our understanding of this really radically changed world that we're dealing with. So it's a pleasure to introduce my friend Misha, and I hope he never writes another book that overtakes mine.
So, I hope this roaming microphone I've got is working. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm going to do a couple of things today. I put this together especially for this event, and it combines a couple of things that I've been doing over the past 10 years or so. One of them is looking historically about how some of these underground networks emerged over the years, and the other is, and so looking at global organized crime as a phenomenon since the collapse of communism, and the other really is to do with what's been happening in the past 10 years, which is the injection of a new form of underground network, and that is the network provided by the internet. So I want to take you back now 11 years. This is where I was on March the 15th, 2003, and somewhere behind that white car is me, walking behind the coffin of this man, Zoran Djindjic, who a few days earlier had been shot in front of the federal government building in Belgrade. And full disclosure here, Zoran was a friend of mine. I'd known him for many years, and I was an admirer of the way that he was trying to modernize Serbia after the trauma that Serbia had suffered because of its previous leader, Slobodan Milosevic, and everything that he had done to the country and indeed to the region as a whole. Now, I investigated Zoran's death. I wanted to know who was behind it. And at first, all the assumptions was that he was killed by a nationalist organization or friends of Milosevic, whom he had helped to send to the International War Crimes Tribunal on Yugoslavia in The Hague. But I discovered that the main reason why he was assassinated was because in December the previous year, 2002, he had promulgated the first Witness Protection Act in southeastern Europe, and that he had actually got a key member of Serbia's underground mafia to testify against some very important people. So I tried to look and see who was the organization who everybody thought was behind his death, and it was a group called the Zemun clan. Zemun is a part of Belgrade, and the main suspect disappeared on the day of Djindjic's death, and subsequently I, and along with other people researching this in the former Yugoslavia, were able to discover that this man, the main suspect, who had been the head of a special forces unit under Milosevic, and was still, in fact, a serving member at the time of Djindjic's death. He had disappeared. He had been an MP in Kosovo for a Serbian nationalist party as well. He had disappeared, and for 2 years he was living in Western Herzegovina. Now, most of you probably don't know, but Western Herzegovina is a stronghold of Croat nationalism. And Croat and Serbian nationalism, of course, they were at daggers drawn for a very long time. So what was a Serbian nationalist and special forces commander doing, living under the protection of a group in Western Herzegovina who were equally notorious for their activities in Croatian special operations against Serbs, and also were notorious for their work in organized crime? The key, the answer to all this, lay in the name of the main suspect, his nickname, in fact, which was Legija. And Legija in Serbian or Croatian means legionnaire. And that's because this man had been a member of the French Foreign Legion in the 1980s. And the man who was protecting him, the Croat nationalist organized crime figure Hrvoje Petrac, had also been a member of the French Foreign Legion and had served together with Legija. When I found this out, I started looking at the various connections between groups all over the former Yugoslavia, and this was one of several networks that was cross-national and cross-border. And what I began to understand, that these people had in fact, underneath the fog of war, been cooperating in a joint enterprise. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of that later on, because that joint enterprise was the model which we have seen repeated since the early 1990s in many parts of the world. Everything began, of course, in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism. Now, don't get me wrong, because I thought this was a terrific thing. I had, in fact, been an activist supporting democratic opposition groups in Eastern Europe up until 1989, and indeed I'd spent some of my teens and early 20s smuggling books and dismembered Xerox machines into people like Charter 77 and Solidarity in Poland. So I had a little bit of experience of cross-border smuggling myself, which was kind of handy. But it wasn't just communism that collapsed in 1989. In many parts of Eastern Europe, the state suffered a total or partial collapse when the Berlin Wall came down. Not only that, in a very short space of time, you changed from a highly, highly regulated, planned economy into a market economy. And of course, a market economy depends upon contract and contract law. But these were all countries which had very little experience of functioning contract law. And at the time, state resources were dwindling very dramatically, leading to a state of partial social, political, and economic chaos. And I'll, in a minute, explain to you what the consequences of that were. At the same time, indeed just before the collapse of communism, between 1986 and 1988, we saw the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom push through a series of reforms regarding financial capital, what you could and couldn't do with money if you were a corporation, which were the beginnings of what we now call globalization. And globalization, of course, shrinks the world, so there it is, the world is shrinking. And the reason why this was important is because all of a sudden, this financial capital could try and persuade other countries to open up their markets with the lure of a large amount of investment. And that started to happen. In 1989, it wasn't only Eastern Europe that started opening up. China was beginning to experiment with absolutely monumental reforms because of Deng Xiaoping. South Africa in 1994 would open up very dramatically to the outside world. Even India, which had had a very closed economy for a long time, introduced a number of really major reforms that would change the shape of the Indian economy. And that meant everywhere around the world there were these increased trade and entrepreneurial opportunities. The problem is that they were very difficult to regulate because the changes were so fast and so dramatic. And it's in the nature of people who are entrepreneurial to push as hard as they can against legal systems. And if the legal systems don't really exist there, that meant that they were interested in trading whatever they could, good stuff and bad. So there we have the second factor, globalization. I'm hoping this thing is working. Oh, there we are. Sorry, that was my fault. Globalization comes on. So we have the collapse of communism. We have globalization, and then we have the human agency. Who was the human agency? Well, let's have a look. You remember I was telling you about the collapse of communism before? Well, let me introduce you to some of the characters post-communism in Bulgaria in this case. Very interesting. I don't know if you remember the Olympics where before 1989, it was always the Bulgarians and the Russians who won the weightlifting and that sort of thing. Well, they were all state subsidized. If you were a weightlifter in Bulgaria, you were frankly a bit of a star. You could get an apartment in the middle of Sofia, you could get a car without having to wait 5 years, and you could travel abroad. 1989 comes, the state collapses, and there's no money left for the wrestlers to enjoy their lifestyle. And so they try and find other things to do, and this is what they did. They took over, in large part, the means of production, and they policed the means of production. They would grasp whole factories which the state could no longer keep hold of, and they were joined by another group of people at the time. Remember, money's very short. There's also a surge of anti-communist feeling, anti-state feeling, because people are fed up with the 40 or 70 years that they've spent under this regime. So one of the things that governments do all around Eastern Europe is they sack people from police forces. In Bulgaria, 14,000 members of the traffic police, of the criminal investigation police, but also of the secret police, lost their jobs between 1989 to 1991. Now, what happens if you have a state that is collapsing, an economy that is heading south, and you release onto the job market 14,000 people whose special skills involve murder, setting up illegal networks, smuggling, and surveillance? What you get is this fabulous operation that I like to call McMafia. They started to run those new markets, the private markets. There were no police, there were no judges capable of explaining how contract law worked. So you had businessman A and businessman B, and they wanted to do a deal, and they needed guarantees for that deal to work. So they said to our friends here, we'll give you 30% of the deal if you make sure that if that other chap reneges on the deal, that he will soon regret it. And so the policing of the markets in Eastern Europe were handed over to the mafia, or what sociologists like to call privatized law enforcement agencies. And this wasn't just happening here. Remember I was telling you that things were changing all over the world in the early 1990s. Well, things were really cooking in Colombia at the time, and one of the first foreign trips made by a joint delegation of the privatized law enforcement agencies of Russia and Serbia was to Aruba in the Caribbean to meet representatives of this chap, Escobar, who we've heard talk of already. A meeting that was brokered by a group of Italian lawyers with connections to certain other privatized law enforcement agencies in southern Italy. So we had that happening there. At the time, Afghanistan was cooking. The Taliban was on the rise, and opium production was going through the roof. I'll come back a little later to opium production and how one regulates that or fails to regulate that. Interestingly enough, we had also had a situation, if it's going to come up, here we are, There we are, in East Asia. These guys, the Yakuza, had made gazillions of dollars out of the property speculation of the late 1980s. And they wanted to spend their money. They were fun, happening type of guys. So they set up brothels all over Southeast Asia, which became the core of the international trade in sex traffic in East Asia. They were so rich that they even had the pleasure of buying up casinos in Las Vegas, which they particularly enjoyed as they saw it as a way of restoring Japanese pride inside the United States. And then, of course, we had the perennial loser, Africa, and the wars for resources in Congo and in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in which companies, sometimes illegitimate, sometimes legitimate, would mine these extraordinary mineral resources of Congo. It's a fascinating story about Congo. We've had war there on and off for about 15 years now. We've had about 6 million people killed there. There's been no conflict anywhere in the world that comes close to the death and destruction wrought in Congo. And yet, as far as I can see, the only time that it has really registered on people's consciousness, either here in the US or in Europe, is when it was featured for 2 episodes of the show ER. And ER set part of it in the Congo, and suddenly people began to understand that there was something really serious going on in this place. Now, that stuff that they were mining in the Congo and selling through organized crime groups onto markets around the world ends up in all sorts of things. Above all else, there is one particular material in the Congo which ends up in mobile phones and laptops. And so this was a huge, huge resource to be mined, and it was done through violence. And the money that was made by selling these mineral resources actually to Western companies through criminal mediators was then spent on getting weapons from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe into the Congo and putting them into the hands of poor children like this. And then you had, in places like the former Yugoslavia, big militia groups, as this one run by Arkan, who was murdered in the year 2000, and an internecine warfare inside the former Yugoslavia, but who used his famous tigers as a way of creating economic control over large parts of the former Yugoslavia, notably in his case, eastern Croatia, in order to extract resources and money from there in order to build up a criminal empire. So that's what we had. We had this combination of the collapse of communism, globalization, and then finally organized crime. And that combination together made up what I refer to as McMafia. And this became the basis for much of what we saw develop over the next 2 decades in terms of, first of all, the establishment of underground networks and then putting their deep roots down. And one of the most important ways of putting their deep roots down is trying to co-opt the state, co-opt politicians, pay politicians money so that they work on their behalf. This is very, very important. My estimation at the time that I was writing McMafia, and I take into account here all the money that is laundered illegally around the world, my figures came up to about 15% of global GDP were accounted for by the global criminal underworld. And one of the most devastating areas, particularly for the advanced economies, was in counterfeit goods, which is a huge trade. And the European Union, this is a figure from 3 years ago, argues that $500 billion is lost every year to the European economy because of counterfeit goods, much of which comes from East Asia. I'm just going to go back now to Yugoslavia, because I want you to see this as a model. Whenever you see a conflict blow up around the world, like Mali, for example, you can be guaranteed that what is going on behind this is the following. So in 1992, in July, the United Nations imposed sanctions. I beg your pardon, in 1991, the United Nations put an arms embargo on all of the former Yugoslavia. Bosnia and Croatia in particular were arguing that you shouldn't because Serbia had an unfair advantage in the number of weapons that it controlled through the Yugoslav People's Army. The minute that that arms embargo was put on, then weapons started pouring into both Croatia and Bosnia, coming from all over the world, from Argentina. We saw a lot of weapons, interestingly, from Russia being sold to Croatia, despite the fact that Russia was politically on Serbia's side. It wasn't going to hand up the opportunity of making stack loads of money by selling weapons to Croatia, so it did that. Very quickly after that, we saw an increase in the amount of cocaine coming into the Balkans, part of it coming through Croatia, part coming through Albania, part of it coming through Bulgaria, and a surge of heroin coming from Central Asia into Serbia. Then there was another iniquitous trade, which was the trafficking of women from all over Eastern Europe through Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Albania. All the time, the paramilitary groups exhorting citizens to fight one another are cooperating in this trade. So things move into Serbia, and then they get sent via Kosovo to Albania. So Albanians and Serbs, although they're at daggers drawn, as I've said before, are cooperating in this criminal operation. Now, the important thing is those red things, women, narcotics, and handguns, they come in to Serbia or other parts of the former Yugoslavia, and where do they go out to? They go out to the European Union. And that is because at this time, the European Union's economy is beginning to pick up. Eventually, it becomes the largest market in the world, 500 million people. And a very significant amount of its citizens like to spend their free time and leisure sleeping with prostitutes, smoking untaxed cigarettes, and sticking 50-euro notes up their nose. The problem about organized crime as a destabilizing factor elsewhere in the world is that the demand for their goods and services in the United States, in Japan, in the Middle East, and in the European Union is very, very significant. And it's important to look at organized crime for what it is, which is an international globalized business where you have zones of production like Colombia or Afghanistan, where you have zones of distribution like Mexico and the Balkans, and you have zones of consumption, which is the industrial world where all the cash is. And what tends to happen is that in the zones of production and distribution, criminal operations attempt to control the government as much as they can, and if they don't, they take up an armed struggle in order to undermine the government. The best example of that at the moment being Mexico, where some 60,000 people have been killed in the last 7 years or so, a ferocious death toll indeed. In the areas of consumption, there is not so much violence because organized criminal networks know that there are strong states, strong institutions, strong law enforcement agencies operating there. And so in those areas, they're trying to fly under the radar the whole time. They do not want to have shootouts in the middle of the street because this will attract the police and it will attract the media. And so it's very difficult to spot the organized crime in those zones of consumption. Now, there was one other thing in Yugoslavia which was very important, and this was the trade in duty-not-paid cigarettes. This is possibly the most widespread commodity that drives organized crime around the world. It is alleged, I couldn't possibly comment, that major cigarette manufacturers are complicit in this trade. Who knows? In the former Yugoslavia, this became immensely important to the economy, particularly of one of the former Yugoslav republics, Montenegro. Cigarettes would come in from places like Azerbaijan. They would fly into Montenegro. They would stay there for 24 hours, and then they would be sent across to Italy. And that's where the problems for law enforcement began. Here's a remarkable little film that I was given by the Italian Coast Guard down in Bari, which gives you a hint of what you're having to deal with if you're involved in law enforcement. Now, this boat here is from Montenegrin smugglers coming across from Montenegro into Italy. At the time, this is in around 1997, 98, those boats, which are the fastest things on the Adriatic, cost about €1 million. Every night, 20 of these boats or so, every night, would come across from Montenegro to Italy. And this was a big problem because the Italian Coast Guards only had 2 boats which were of a comparable speed to these things. And so every time they wanted to chase them down, they would have to exert huge resources. This is one of the few successful captures of a smuggling boat coming from Montenegro to Italy, and in a minute you'll see how many resources it takes to catch just one of them. Over this period, 10 years from 91 to 2001, the British Exchequer is estimated to have lost £6 billion, that's $10 billion, to cigarette smuggling. So that's how you do it. You need 6 vessels to catch one. Think about the resources required to do that and what you're up against if you're involved in law enforcement now with that. But here was a problem with this situation, and the problem was Montenegro, although part of the Yugoslav Federation, was opposing Slobodan Milosevic. It was actually a sort of Western island in the former Yugoslavia. It was under sanctions, however, UN sanctions from July 1992. So how could it survive, Montenegro? The answer is the only way it could survive was through smuggling. The Italians were very unhappy about this because it was giving a huge boost to the 4 major organized crime groups in southern Italy. But the Americans and the British argued to the Italians that they couldn't go against Montenegro because it was so important in the struggle against Milosevic. Now, that's a really big problem with organized crime and underground networks. Politics often gets in the way, and you're faced with dilemmas which are actually impossible to resolve. It was resolved largely in 2001 after Milosevic had fell. There was a meeting between the Montenegrin president and President Clinton in Ljubljana in Slovenia, in which Mr. Clinton said the cigarettes game is basically up. And largely that was complied with. In Moscow, Moscow is very, very important because of the huge resources available to anyone involved in Russian organized crime. We saw the major organized crime groups emerge here. Lyubetsy, Izmailovskaya, Dolgoprudnaya, and Sansevo. Now, the reason why they emerged there, if you notice, that's the Beltway, the Moscow Beltway, the MCAT, right? So these were all districts which is where the working class were put during the communist period. And so you had a concentration of hard nuts from the working class. But of course, because it's on the MCAT, they're near the arterial areas of Moscow. They're also all near either river ports or airports. And these 4 groups became the 4 most powerful organized crime group, apart from one other, the Chechen organized crime group in Moscow. And this is where their bosses lived, because the oligarchs, who we all know about, who ran gangster capitalism in the 1990s, had this symbiotic relationship with the organized crime groups in Moscow. And that structure has largely sustained itself in the last 23 years or so, except for one thing. When Putin came into power, former KGB officers worked as subordinates, head of security for people like Boris Berezovsky, Abramovich, and all the other oligarchs who are famous from Russia. What Putin did, coming from a KGB background, the oligarchs thought that they were going to be able to control Putin just like they had controlled Yeltsin. Putin, however, was younger, was smarter, much more ambitious and aggressive than Yeltsin. And he flipped the situation, and he subordinated the oligarchs to him. And he said to the oligarchs, quite simply, this is what you're going to do. You're either going to support me, or you can go into exile, or I shall expropriate all your funds, or I'll kill you. And in the case of Khodorkovsky, I'll imprison you for a long time. And so Putin changed the gangster capitalism of the 1990s into a sort of KGB market authoritarianism that we have now. And that was going to have huge implications for all of us. So we had these networks all over the world for the past 20 years, the gangster capitalism of the last 20 years. So that's sort of what we're starting to work with. And for the second half of the talk, I want to take you into an area of what's happened since then. Oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. All of this moving of money is dependent upon offshore banking centers. Now, we are finally seeing some movement from the G7 countries to do something about these centers. But for a long time, they refused to do anything, even though they were essential to the movement of illegitimate funds, of oligarchs and organized crime all around the world. The reason why nothing was done about them is that they were always also used by our biggest corporations to evade tax. The laws, if you can dignify them with the word laws, that prevail in these centers allow people to set up companies without revealing who their beneficial owner is. And that means you can set up hundreds of companies which are owned by fake representatives of the real owner, and you can literally chase a company around the world, seeing dozens of companies behind it, and you have no idea who is actually, who the money, has got the money behind those. Now, the US, I have to say, on this area has proved to be much more engaged than a lot of the European Union. And it is now pushing hard on the issue of beneficial ownership, that if you have a company, even if it's in the Caymans or wherever, you have to say who is behind it. There are few acts which, if agreed upon by the Western world, will do more to combat the movement of illicit money around the world than this one. And I believe it to be of great significance if it goes through. The United States has also led the way with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I have to say, when the Department of Justice gets its teeth into some nasty criminal oligarch around the world, it really is tenacious. It does a very, very good job. But these things have to be coordinated between the European Union and the United States. And often we see different interests involved there. But this issue of money and the movement of money is really critical. So, now back to, now what's happening there? Once again, we're not getting any movement on the clicker. Ah, there we are. Yes, here we are. I just wanted to show you this because this was wonderful. I was driving on the Egyptian-Israeli border, and then suddenly these camels reared up from Egypt, and these kids, they were Bedouin kids carrying cocaine, moved through into Israel. Now, the reason why this is happening is because the Israelis are putting Bedouins into what are effectively townships. And the only way, the rate of unemployment amongst the Bedouins is huge. And what the Bedouins are good at is roaming over large territories. And they were fantastic smugglers, bringing goods and services from Egypt into Israel. Israel is a very big consumer of illegal drugs and a particularly strong market for women trafficked for sexual purposes. Now, this is now in a state of chaos because of what's been going on in Egypt, and it has real national security implications for Israel, the collapse of the Egyptian control of their side of the border on the Sinai and the Negev. And what the Bedouins are now apparently moving into is more security-based work, i.e. bringing arms and stuff into Israel. So it's one of the things that I want to highlight is that organized crime networks are parasitic. They do not want their host to die. They want their host to live because they want to continue getting money off it. But they don't care who feeds off that host along with them. And so where organized crime is doing the trailblazing in terms of what they can and they can't do in terms of making money, terrorist organizations follow very, very quickly behind. And as long as organized crime is making money out of it, they'll cooperate with terrorist organizations, and terrorist organizations are quite happy to cooperate with organized crime as well, as long as they are benefiting from their perspective. This is, in terms of security, the number one problem about organized crime is they open up opportunities for all sorts of people. And finally, I want, on this half of the talk, I want to come to the issue of narcotics. The world has a drugs problem, and I don't mean in this sense that it has a drug consumption problem. It has a drugs policy problem. Drugs policy is now going all over the place. Most South American countries have decided that they do not want to fully comply with Washington's preferred drug policy of the war on drugs. And so you're seeing steady decriminalization, in some places even legalization of narcotics in South America, because they argue that the problem is one of US demand for narcotics, but it is their citizens who are ending up dead as a consequence of this. The problem is that narcotics are so ubiquitous. This is a picture from a house in Nelson, British Columbia, that I visited, where one of the many illegal but organically certified marijuana farms are in operation. Of course, their main market is California. And for the Californians, that organic certification is the all-important thing. And there is now so much being produced in North America alone that one of the reasons why the cocaine market from Colombia became so important was because their marijuana was no longer being bought in California. And so cocaine became even more of a problem than it was. Now, the reason why I highlight the drugs thing is because we are now getting different policies emerging all over the world on narcotics. Even within the United States, we now, of course, have 2 states where marijuana has been legalized. We have the constitutional chaos of California and medical marijuana in California, and it really is constitutional chaos. This is something that has to be dealt with. Now, the British government has come under a lot of pressure inside the United Kingdom. This, incidentally, is the kind of money you can make just off smuggling marijuana in Canada. These have all been confiscated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, that's Inspector Brian Cantera from the RCMP, from the drug smugglers of British Columbia. But it is absolutely huge. So they can afford to lose helicopters, they can afford to lose boats, they can afford to lose everyone, and it is still a huge raging trade. In eastern British Columbia, in towns like Nelson, the mayors of Nelson don't allow the RCMP, which legally they can do, to enter into the town for drug busts because half of the city's economy is based on marijuana. So, and this is the problem, is that the profit margins on drugs are so monumental. This is a report from the United Kingdom under the Blair government, which was suppressed, that it is the 101 for criminal networks, whether terrorist or strictly criminal. Everyone wants to get into narcotics. And the law enforcement capacity of the world collectively simply isn't enough. And that's why we have problems of things like Mali. If you look at the Maghreb, so much of what is going on is about shifting cocaine and marijuana into Europe. It's not about initially insurgency, but then insurgents start to make huge sums of money. West Africa, completely chaotic because of the cocaine trade coming from South America, just as a transit on its way to Europe. States are being undermined. And so I do believe that the time has come to start bringing some coherence to drugs policy, because at the moment there is very little. And it's narcotics above anything else, I think, that allow people to get into underground networks very quickly. I say anything else, but that was before this came along in the year 2000. Now, I don't know if you remember, in the year 2000 there was this spectacular virus that went around the world, and it was called the I love you virus. So you'd get an email from someone that said, I love you, and of course you see it and you say, oh, who is it who loves me? I got to, yes, I'm happily married or whatever, but oh God, oh, it's them. Oh my word, we're all human, let's face it. So now I was very fortunate when the I love you virus first came out, because the first person I received it from was my ex-wife. And this is perfectly true. And she harbored all sorts of emotions towards me, but love was not amongst them. So as soon as I saw this, oh, wait a minute, something funny about that. And I took it straight away and put it in the recycle bin. Very sensible. But the reason why I highlight this is the problem about computers is not necessarily about people who are technically brilliant. About 85 to 90% of computer attacks start with something like this, social engineering. Unfortunately, everyone who uses a computer is a vulnerability. And that means, I'll be perfectly honest, that means we have a lot of really easy targets dotted around the world. Now, people are finally waking up to the fact that we've got to do something about computer security. And I want to show you a couple of films to explain why. This first one is actually about trying to protect your children.
Schmidt, Peters, Jansen, Hermanns. Is your son home?
Yes, he's up in his room. Come in.
Hi, is Klausy here?
Yeah, upstairs.
Well then, we'll go up and try out some kinky stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Cool location.
Where's Klaus?
There.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Is this little Anna? You've got a nice bunny. Come on, I'll show you a real bunny.
In real life, you would protect your children. So why not protect them on the internet?
So, unfortunately, we have very little idea what's going on in our networks at any one time. And it's taken a lot of time to realize that this has been going on. Now, I talk to companies all over the world about cybersecurity, and you would be amazed how many people still run their operations like this.
Hello, IT. Have you tried turning it off and on again? Oh, okay, well, the button on the side, is it glowing? Yeah, you need to turn it on. The button turns it on? Yeah. You do know how a button works, don't you? No, not on clothes.
Hello, IT? Yeah, huh?
Have you tried forcing an unexpected reboot?
No, there you go. No, there you go. I just heard it come on. No, that's the music you hear when it comes on. No, that's the music you hear when it... I'm sorry, are you from the past?
You see, the driver hooks a function by patching the system call table, so it's not safe to unload it unless another thread's about to jump in there and do its stuff, and you don't want to end up in the middle of invalid memory. Hello?
So, and this is how it's done. And people involved in organized criminal groups know how stupid we are. They have all the good narratives. They have the I love you viruses. They have a way of persuading us. And we have no way of responding to this because ordinary people don't care about computer security. They care about innovation. They care about the next tablet. They care about all the fancy things that they can do with it, and they want it fast and they want it now. And our desire for innovation and speed in the internet is overriding security in every way. Now, you may say, well, if it's not related to national security, it's one company who isn't running their place properly, why bother? Well, I want to show you why it bothers. Here are companies that I've written or worked for all of these companies one way or the other, and in the past 12 months, they have all been subject to major cyber attacks. It's very difficult for media companies to avoid it because one of the things you have to do, it's increasingly tedious if you're a journalist, is you have to respond to every sort of idiotic query that you get about a story. You have to be communicating the whole time. This makes media operations much more difficult to manage from a security point of view than banks or financial institutions. But let me show you a little bit of what happens when goes wrong. Exactly 1 year ago today, Associated Press put out this tweet. Breaking 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama is injured, right? It wasn't actually put out by the Associated Press. It was put out by the Syrian Electronic Army, which is a pro-Assad organization that hacked into AP's Twitter account, set that out. So that's what it did. It was about, it's about 3 minutes work for a hacker. And this was the consequence. That's what a 90 billion drop in Wall Street looks like. And that's what happened as a consequence of that one tweet, right? So, 3 minutes work, bored hacker sitting in Damascus, that's what happens in New York. And that's why cybersecurity is no longer just about technology and geeks or national security. We're so interconnected that we have to start understanding what is the psychology, what is the legal situation, what is the moral situation about cybersecurity. It is the #1 issue. Here's a guy who, if ever you speak to security technicians who are in the IT world, they go weak at the knees for Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher. I'd never heard of him before I started writing my book on cybersecurity. After about half an hour, you know everything he's ever said. Everyone loves Sun Tzu now. Here's one of his latest acolytes, and I thought maybe next year Sovereign Challenge could invite Paris Hilton to give us her thoughts on Sun Tzu's legendary tome, The Art of War. So everyone's reading it. And what is it that, actually, if you read Sun Tzu, it's quite simple. Everything's boiled down to about 5 ideas. Here's the main one, as far as I'm concerned, which is very important. Know your opponent and learn from him. Now, but how many people really take that into account, including people in cybersecurity who love him so much? What do we actually know about hackers? Where do they come from? Who are they? Are they a particular nationality? Are they a particular gender? Well, I can tell you they are a particular gender. 96% of hackers are male. In fact, the internet is run almost entirely by men. When I was writing Dark Market, which is about criminal hackers, I spent months and months trying to track down a single female hacker. I couldn't do it. I finally got one, Karen Olsen, and it turns out it was her boyfriend who was using her name to do it. It's ridiculous. What do we know about autism and other spectrum disorders and how they relate to hacking? Well, I can tell you it has, in some cases, there is an important relationship here. Otherwise, SAP, the major German software company, would not have started advertising last year for people with autism and Asperger's syndrome to come and work with them. Not because SAP is necessarily a sort of, good community company, but because they know that these people have fabulous skills and that they may not have the social skills that leaves them to be accepted in wider society, but in the environment of the internet, they're really fantastic. So that's one thing. They're all male. In the hackers who I interviewed, most of them had advanced ability in science and maths if they weren't social engineers. They came from all over the world. They came from all races. They came from all social classes. And in the year 2000, a group of these people in Odessa, in Ukraine, gangster capitalism, came together to create a website which revolutionized cybercrime around the world. And this website was called Carter Planet. This was an advert that Carter Planet put out over the internet in the year 2000. And it became one of the most popular sites on the web. This is what happened when you went into Carter Planet, www.carterplanet.com. It was a forum. You could go there, you could talk to people about the latest cybercrime techniques, you could buy and sell credit cards, you could buy and sell fake passports, you could buy and sell real passports. And this group of people gave us the template of cybercriminal activity on the web. Why was that? Because the greatest threat to anyone who's engaged in underground activity on the web is how do I trust the guy I'm doing business with when he's a criminal? So it's axiomatic that he's untrustworthy. And these people at Carter Planet, a group of Russians and Ukrainians in Odessa, came up with the escrow system. So any trade that happened, say buying and selling credit cards, was done through an escrow officer who would check and see whether the fake credit cards were working by sending them electronically around the world to their friends, who would try them in ATM machines, and then he would release the money that he'd received from the purchaser and the goods received from the vendor. And for the first 10 years of this millennium, this century, it was a champagne era for credit and debit card fraud. But the reason why I'm highlighting this is partly because terrorist organizations also engaged in this type of activity. It became an important source of funding, but also because what was happening in that 10 years was networks were being built up all over the world. Now, I interviewed some of the people involved in Carter Planet and subsequent forums like that, such as Shadow Crew and Dark Market. Now, they're going to be talking here about credit card fraud, but there's a reason why I'm highlighting that at the moment. One thing you need to know is that the word dumps means bulk data about credit card. But these are all criminal hackers who I interviewed, and these are the verbatim answers I got. I only interview people face-to-face. If I'm not interviewing them face-to-face, they don't make it into any of my books because I can't verify who they are. And that's particularly true on the internet, where deception is absolutely critical for the way people exchange ideas.
Cracking the international phone roaming system was one of my easiest targets. So basically I can send a message from anybody's cell phone anywhere in the world to anybody else's, and I write what I want. I've had a lot of fun with it.
The great majority of those carders who are arrested are either young, naive, or careless. As far as I know, none of the powerful syndicates selling dumps in bulk like the Russian group SMA have ever been detected or arrested. My sense is the feds don't even know who they are.
The most basic rule, as far as I am concerned, is never, ever, touch American cards. It is not because American cards are difficult. No chip and pin means that they are the easiest in the world. It is because if you do American cards, then you are under the jurisdiction of the FBI and the Secret Service. Canadian and European police I can handle. but I prefer to stay away from the feds.
I want you to listen to this next one quite carefully.
We were not born yesterday. We are serious operators. We have a digital and we have a human intelligence capacity. The FBI and soccer may be watching us, but we are watching them in return. We anticipate and we analyze all their serious moves.
SOCA, by the way, is the Suspended Serious Organized Crime Association in the United Kingdom. But this is really important because hackers, criminal hacking networks, political hacking networks have a counterintelligence capacity which is quite remarkable. It shouldn't be underestimated. Here's something that happened last year in the United Kingdom. So, the Serious Organised Crime Agency looked in to the case of 3 of Britain's regional police forces to find that their computers had been hacked into, and private investigators working with organised criminal groups had managed to get into the National Police database and change records of ongoing investigations in that database. I don't really need to explain how disturbing that is as a precedent, but this sort of thing is going on all the time. One of the reasons for that is that the internet was constructed just as a sort of, oh, let's put a bit here and a bit there and a bit there and a bit there, and security was never part of the construction of the internet at all, and so every so often we get something like the Heartbleed vulnerability, which came out about 10 days ago, where the very infrastructure of the net, not because anyone's put a vulnerability there, it just happens to be sitting there. And lots and lots and lots of organizations around the world had their data stolen as a consequence of Heartbleed. So what are you going to do? If you speak to security experts, they all say the same thing. Really what we should do is close down the internet and build it afresh from the beginning with security concerns integrated. But of course, we can't do that. That's not going to happen. And that again puts the emphasis on all of us in terms of ensuring our safety on the internet. That's often very difficult. It would be great if we had the 3 pillars, which I like to explain, of cyber malfeasance, cyber crime, cyber industrial espionage, and the big one, cyber warfare. It would be terrific if the police could look after cybercrime, that the private sector could look after commercial industrial espionage, and that the military could look after cyber warfare. One thing I noticed when I was investigating Dark Market, the website, which was a forum like Carter Planet, was that there were 2 human agencies, and you always have to look at the human agency behind the technological hype, which make this very difficult. And those are spies, intelligence agents, and hackers. They're around all the criminal websites. They're even exchanging ideas. I have to say a very embarrassing thing, that both the Secret Service and the FBI had an undercover agent on Dark Market who were investigating each other. This, incidentally, is post all the 2001, we've got to talk to each other and stuff like that. And it wasn't until an agent from the Serious Organised Crime Agency in Britain gently told Washington that 2 of their agents were investigating each other that this was brought to a halt. You never know who you're dealing with. You don't know if you're dealing with a hacker or you're dealing with a spy. You know that you're dealing with people who are very sophisticated. And let me go back to the wonderful world of Carter Planet to explain how this world works. Amongst many other things that Carter Planet did was in the year 2000, they held the first ever worldwide Carter's conference. It was a publicly advertised conference of criminal activity. Absolutely fantastic. There it is, the first worldwide Carter's conference. I very, very happily found in what's called the darknet, I found the press release of the first ever worldwide Carter's conference. It was held in Odessa, of course, and for those of you who know Odessa, it was held in the Hotel Odessa, just by the Potemkin steps, and it had plenary sessions in the Hotel Odessa, and it had breakout sessions in restaurants and bars with topics like, why do we focus on Visa and MasterCard? Why can't we develop niche markets in JCB and diners, for example? Very sensible if you're a credit card fraudster. Anyway, when I was reading the press release of the first Worldwide Cardist Conference, I couldn't help but be struck by this first comment. And this was the first thing they said. It's in Russian, but I've translated it for you. Once again, the critical issue of the inadmissibility of any action in relation to the billing system, banks, or any other financial institution in the Commonwealth of Independent States, that was Russia's operation at the time of the former Soviet Union, especially Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus was raised. Furthermore, the family, that's the people who run Carter Planet, will deal, sorry, I'll go back if I can, will deal with anyone who does anything with this. So I said, well, that's very strange. There's a group of criminal hackers who are saying you can't attack financial institutions in Russia and Ukraine. So I spoke to two of the founders of Carter Planet. I said, what was all that about? And they said, oh, well, it's quite simple. I said, obviously, the KGB knew what we were doing from the very beginning. And they were one of the people who came to the first Worldwide Cardist Conference as well, and they took us aside and they made it perfectly plain. They say, you know, if you attack anything in Russia or Ukraine, here is what's going to happen to you. You will be arrested and you will be put in Siberia and you'll never come back again. And here's the second part of the deal, they said. When we require you for the purposes of national security operations, you will jump to and do what we say. Now that's very important because Russia is able to deploy criminal ability in its national security operations when it comes to the cyber wing without any difficulty at all. Incidentally, you may have noticed there's sort of some debate about Ukraine being attacked by Russian computers over the past 2 weeks or so. Let me tell you now, Russia controls Ukraine's internet. There is no thing of like they're having to attack it or anything like that. It's totally in their pocket already. So, but that raises the question of what I was trying to explain about what happens with these underground networks is there is a fusing, a collapsing of politics and crime, which is very dangerous. And what's happening now? The internet's reached supersaturation in the West already. This is where it's growing. Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And people working here are fantastically good at what they do. The Kenyans are so way ahead of everyone in mobile technology. And it's a great thing that they've done with mobile banking systems in particular. Unfortunately, there's a small, very small percentage of Kenyans who know how to use mobile phones who are hacking mobile phones all over the world because they're so good with this technology. The number of Trojans discovered on mobiles has doubled in the last 3 months. This is one of the big expansion areas. And the problem is, because of the fact that the internet is sort of connected with everyone, often you don't have sufficient cooperation between law enforcement agencies and in the various countries to be able to prosecute things, because internet crime can start in one place and end in another, as we know. And so I want to end up, just finally, looking at the issue of the NSA and what the problem with the NSA revelations is in terms of security. Because there are two problems about this. First of all, the thing that struck me is if the NSA can't keep its secrets, what chance has anyone else got? That's one thing. But the second thing is that the NSA revelations have helped to polarize the approach to internet security. And I go to lots of conferences where the NSA is represented, and also civil liberty groups and internet freaks and that sort of thing. It seems to me there is no middle ground. You have the desire for people to have national security override privacy entirely on the internet, and you have people who want no role for national security on the internet. The internet is, of course, the fantastically powerful communications tool, the most powerful in history, and of course it's going to be regulated and governed by the state. Of course it is, and of course there's going to be a national security role, but what really worries me is the middle ground has gone. And that's something that we've got to change. We've got to find out what is the balance that we need in terms of establishing that middle ground. The other problem is that states who were traditionally quite well disposed towards the US and the United Kingdom and the Five Eyes group are moving towards the positions of Russia and China when it comes to internet governance. And there is a real danger that what we're seeing going on now is a massive fracturing, a fragmentation of the internet into giant state-based intranets. And that is not in our interest at all. And so what I want to finish up with, this final thought, is the problem that you have nowadays is that you're shifting away from a world in which you can identify and do something about criminal networks, albeit taking a lot of time and money, into a world where you do not know what you're dealing with. And we need as much understanding as possible. Thank you very much.
Misha's got an airplane to catch, but I think we can have one or two questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's good to see you in person. What about this anonymous which you're talking? One of your comments struck me, especially about the hackers when you were talking, that don't jail them. Is that right? Don't jail them, hire them. When you don't know them, when you don't know about the motivation of them, and you don't know, in fact, who are paying them, then how could you make such kind of comments? Is it contradicting? And also it's when everything is unknown. So because possibly the book, when you were writing down, it was not the time. So clarify that point for me. How could you say that?
Well, I keep in touch with the hackers who I interviewed for Dark Market. As I said, I mean, I didn't write about them unless I went to meet them. And it wasn't just their testimony that was going on. It was also court documents. It was their friends and colleagues who they'd worked with and this sort of thing. And so I built up a picture of who these people were, their criminal records or lack of criminal records, what their background was, and so on and so forth. And so I did as much as one possibly can to establish who they are. And if you meet them, it's a big, big leap from if you're just talking to them on the internet. But I keep in touch with them, several of those guys up there who do tell me what is happening in terms of developments in the criminal world. And you know, I mean, they're one of my sources. The police are another of my sources, and they generally, and private sector, are also very important in explaining to me what's going on. And generally, they sort of agree on the way things are moving. And so it's a triangulation of sources, I guess. Well, I did explain that relationship, how that relationship developed in Russia. I can't really go around all the world and say how everyone's doing it. On things like Anonymous, one's not entirely sure what Anonymous is by the very nature. This is the political group which tends to swarm against corporations and countries that it doesn't like. It's Anonymous, we know, has attacked security companies here in the United States. It's also one of the things that gets talked about less about Anonymous is that they have also attacked the internet communications of Boko Haram, the Islamic fundamentalist group in Nigeria. They have taken on the Mexican cartels, about the only people I know in the world, apart from the Mexican army, who've taken on the cartels, and had a standoff with them. And that's well documented what happened there, both from the cartel side and from Anonymous side. And they were some of the first to try and disrupt Assad's internet communication system into Syria as well. So you have ambiguity built into all these organizations, and you're absolutely right. It is very difficult to identify who's doing what, but that doesn't mean that we can't apply the usual tools of investigation and research to get an idea of what's going on. I've literally got to fly.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Admiral McCraven and Lieutenant General Highhold, I found it fascinating, as I enjoy the historical context, but when you talked about, and we talked yesterday about framing and how you have to look at things differently, how a network can be opposed in a conflict but support each other for the criminal nexus, and then obviously cyber is a fascinating topic and from an economical perspective, a very expensive proposition. So on behalf of Sovereign Challenge, I'd like to present you with this plaque.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for
I'll
your
be
time.
going up in my office. Thank you very much indeed.